Hi everybody, this is Joy at Pine Quilt Shop. Today we are going to talk about terminology that gets used in the quilting world. Everything has their own set of acronyms, and we have some of them that we use in quilting. And if you're a newer sewer, it's sometimes hard to figure out what all those acronyms are. So we're going to start by talking about two acronyms that are used to refer to block construction, and that is HST, half square triangle, and QST, quarter square triangle. So the quilt beside me has a half square triangle right here, and half square triangles are triangle shapes. There's two of them that make up each half of the block, and together they form a square. So that is where the term half square triangle comes from. Now when we cut these, we normally will cut half square triangle pieces from a square, split once on the diagonal, because we want to keep the straight of grain on the outside of our block, and there's bias along this seam line, but that's an interior seam. So it's nice to keep the straight of grain on the outside of your block, so as you're handling it, it's not stretching on you. The block right beside it is a quarter square triangle. So it is made up of 4 pieces, so 4 quarters. They are triangles, and again, sewn together, they make a square. Now, when you cut quarter square triangle pieces, those are normally cut from a larger square, and we bisect it on both diagonals and then shuffle the pieces like we did here and sew them back together to make the block out of multiple fabrics. But when we start out with that larger square split on both diagonals, we're again keeping the straight of grain along the outside edge of the block. There's bias here and here, there's straight of grain here. So that is typically how you would cut fabric for a quarter square triangle. So next up, we're going to talk fat quarters versus long quarters. So what I have in front of me is a fat quarter that's not split yet, but it's what you would get when you buy a fat quarter of fabric. So a fat quarter starts out as a half yard cut, and that is what this is. It's a half yard cut. So it is 18 inches, maybe a little bit more than 18. And what we do at the shop is we cut a half yard and we line up the selvages, and then we will go ahead and split this on the folds. So we do it sometimes with a scissor, or we might slide a ruler down and then trim off that tiny little sliver of fabric. So what you get is what you see here. So it is 18 inches by approximately 20 to 21 inches, sometimes a little more. It's going to vary a little bit depending on the gray good, the fabric good that the fabric was printed on. They vary slightly in width. We know there's variation. Typically with a fat quarter, I would feel like the safe amount to use off of a fat quarter is 17 inches by 20. Any fat quarter that you buy, you should have a usable 17 by 20 inches. But when you buy the fat quarter, it's going to be 18, maybe a little more than 18 by half a width of fabric, whatever that happens to be for that particular fabric, which again will be typically somewhere between 20 and 21 inches. And that is what a fat quarter is. Now, you also will see the term fat eighth, and I'm going to fold this in half just to show you what you get when you buy a fat eighth. So a fat eighth will be a quarter yard cut. So it's twice as wide as a typical long eighth yard cut, which is only 4.5 inches. It's twice as wide, it's 9. But again, it's split on the fold. So you're getting 9 inches by a half a width of fabric in a fat eighth. And a regular eighth yard cut would be 4.5 inches, but a full width of fabric. So sometimes in the shop, you'll hear us use the term a long quarter or a fat quarter, a long eighth or a fat eighth. The long ones are those width of fabric to width of fabric cuts that are 4.5 inches or 9 inches. The fat versions are twice as wide, so rather than 4.5, it's 9, but they're split on the fold, so they're only a half a width of fabric. So it's the same amount of fabric, but the form factor is different. This one is fatter and shorter, the other one is long and skinny. And that is the difference between fat quarters and fat eighths versus long quarters and long eighths. The last term that we're going to talk about is one that again gets used quite commonly. You'll see WOF, width of fabric, LOF, length of fabric, and width of fabric cuts are cut from selvage to selvage. So if the pattern tells you to cut 4.5 inches by width of fabric, you would cut a strip this way, so you're cutting selvage to selvage. If it says to cut length of fabric, then you're going to cut this way, so you are cutting parallel to the selvage. So this is length of fabric parallel to the selvage. Width of fabric is from selvage to selvage. That also applies to your grain. This is the length of fabric grain. It will typically have the least amount of stretch. This is your width of fabric grain. It will be the next least amount of stretch. And then we have the bias grain, which is that diagonal grain that has a lot of stretch. So that is length of fabric, width of fabric from a cutting and also from a grain standpoint. So those are some commonly used terms. We hope it's helpful for you to have some explanation about what those actually mean. So thanks for joining us today.